Arye, thank you so much for joining us today and being willing to be our first person. We are glad to have you here. You have so much to tell us. We have a short period, so we'll just jump right in if you don't mind.
Please.
World War II began with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Your parents were married in 1941, and you were born April 7th, 1942, which was more than 2.5 years after the war began. Before we turn to what happened to you and your family after your birth, let's start first with you telling us what you can about your family and what you know of their lives before you were born.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you everybody for coming here today. My father was one of 8 children, 6 boys and 2 girls, and born to a very religious Jewish family in Bardejov, Slovakia. And his father ran the general store in that little town, with the boys of the family working with him at the store. My father, by the time the war started, was already in his early 30s, and a cause for worry for his parents because he wasn't married yet, and he was very choosy in who he chose to associate with. He was by that time pretty well to do economically from his work in the store, but as I said, still single. My mother was born in Hungary. Her father was a lumber merchant, and she was born in a very small town, and her family was much more modern in the sense they were not the Orthodox religious Jews as my father's family was. She could very easily have passed for a non-Jewish person by her appearance. When the Nazis invaded Hungary, they deported many Jews. Before they started taking them to the concentration camps, they deported many Jews, including my mother's family, who had to leave everything behind and move. They found refuge in a Czechoslovakian city, pretty large city named Brno. And that they showed up there with no possessions, and my father and her father was trying to find a way to sustain his family. And not long after that, they were deported from Brno as well, and they found refuge in a small village near Bardejov, which was my father's village. As they arrived there, the local Jewish community met them and accepted them, and my grandmother, my mother's mother, was bemoaning the fact that here they are with absolutely no possessions. They had to leave everything behind other than the shirts on their backs. And she has 2 daughters, my mother and a younger sister, and how is she going to get those daughters married without a dowry, which was the custom in Europe at the time, that a bride arrives with a dowry to her wedding. One of the local people said, aha, I happen to know of this family nearby Bardejov, and they are besides themselves because they say they happen to have a son who is in his 30s and well-to-do, but very choosy in terms of girlfriends. Maybe he wouldn't care about dowry. Maybe we can get the 2 of those together, which they did, and the rest of that is history.
As we said in the introduction, your father was able to keep his store for a long time because it was considered essential. Why did the Nazis consider it essential? What was it that he was selling that was important?
The general store, it was the one general store in town, and it sold basically, that was the mini Walmart of Czechoslovakia. It had everything from horse feed to bolts to groceries. So they sold basically a little bit of, it wasn't a very large store, but they sold basically everything that anybody needed. That's where they went. And some of it, both the perishable, the food items and so on, and some of the hardware became useful to everybody, including the German occupiers. By the way, as long as we are talking about the chance meeting of my father and my mother, I know that arranged marriages or marriages by blind date may sound quaint nowadays, but I must tell you that they were married all their lives, close to 60 years. And they went through some very hard times, through the war and then later after the war as well. And not once have I heard them a cross word going between them or any other attitude other than just respect and love. And I think there is a lot to be said for that.
Thanks for sharing that. Sadly, the day that you were born, April 7th, 1942, as we mentioned, was also the day of the first transports taking Jews to Auschwitz. Tell us the circumstances of your birth and then how your parents were able to then avoid deportation.
And the word transport in the context of the Holocaust, as many of you know, was enough to cause shivers in everybody's spine in Europe at the time. A transport did not mean what it means today, a transport. A transport meant that the local German authorities published a list of names of local residents who were required to report to the local train station with one suitcase of personal belongings, where they were crammed into cattle cars, train cars, 100 and 120 people to a car, and taken to what was billed as a labor camp. In the case of Bardejov, the transport on the day I was born, the first transport out of Bardejov, was going to a newly opened concentration camp in Poland named Auschwitz. And even though Auschwitz was only a few months old at the time, it already had a very bad reputation of people who went there and never to be heard from again. And so when the order for people to show up at the train station went out, many people, of course, complied, as they have everywhere, because the penalty for non-compliance was to be shot. Many people complied, but some people preferred to take their chances. Bardejov was surrounded by forest, and some people escaped into the forest to avoid going on that transport. Among them was my father. My mother was in labor in that day, and she could not leave the house, and she stayed home with her housekeeper, who later helped her deliver her son. Also, it's an interesting point that my mother's obstetrician, his name was Dr. Rudolf Radach. He was a Czechoslovakian non-Jewish, and he had no reason to fear for his life at that point. But it turns out that Dr. Radach's mother, when he was a boy, when he was a young boy, his mother worked as a housekeeper in the household of the Jewish doctor in town, in Bardejov. And the Jewish doctor took a liking to the young Rudolf, who turned out to be a very bright boy, and saw to it that he got a good education, which normally he wouldn't have gotten, being the son of a housekeeper. And when he graduated from high school, the Jewish doctor supported him through medical school until Rudolf Radach became Dr. Radach. He did it out of the goodness of his heart, but there was a gossip, an evil gossip in town, that perhaps he did it because little Rudolf may have been his illegitimate son. That was enough for the Germans to suspect Dr. Radach of having some Jewish blood in him. And therefore, when the transport order came out, even though he was a good Catholic who went to church every Sunday, he was on the list of Jews to be transported. And he ran to the forest as many other people did. He came back after dark into my mother's home to tend to her after I was born.
You said to me that at that time the Germans were very methodical as they took their lists with names on them. Tell us what happened when they came for your mother's sister.
At the beginning, as you said, Bill, the Germans were working according to the German order of things. They took people on the list. They had a methodology of it blows my mind to think of the industrialized murder, the industrial scale murder of people, of thousands, of millions of people, worked in a bureaucratic, orderly, official, process-oriented way. They had lists of names. They were looking for certain people. Toward the end of the war, they were a little less orderly and more panicked, and they took anybody who they could. But at that point, they haven't. And they showed up at my mother's home, my grandmother's home, looking for my mother's younger sister. And I have no idea what caused them to decide that out of all the Jews in Europe, they needed my aunt, my mother's sister, to take that day. But they showed up to take my mother's younger sister, who was not home at the time. And so they told my grandmother, we are going to be back in the evening, and she better be here. And my grandmother told them, you know what? My daughter is a young girl. She was in her maybe 20 years old at the time. My daughter is a young girl, and her whole life is ahead of her. I am an old woman, and I have lived my life. Why don't you take me instead and fulfill your quota? Being German, they said, no, we need to take her. I'm thinking about, back on that, my grandmother, the old lady who had already lived a life, she was 48 years old at the time. She was taken shortly thereafter, after the Germans gave up on the going by lists, and the wife of the keeper of the local synagogue got sick. And so my grandmother went over to their house to bring them some hot soup, because the woman of the house was sick and couldn't cook. So she went over with hot soup for the family, and it so happened that she showed up there just as a German squad was there taking the family away. And as soon as she showed up, they took her away as well. And that's the last that anybody had seen of her. My grandfather was at work at the time, and he heard what happened, and not wanting to part with his wife, he ran to the train station and managed to get on the same train. And both of them were taken, and that was the end of them.
And you had shared with me, Arye, that your grandfather, when he did that, there was no question he knew what he was doing.
By that time, there was no question that you got on the train, you were going to your death. That, of course, was known.
Arye, about a year after your birth, your parents concluded they couldn't keep you safe in Bardejov and made the decision to have your mother take you to Hungary with her while your father remained behind in Bardejov. How did they arrange for you and your mother to go to Hungary? And tell us about the efforts they went through to get you there, and then tell us what your mother did once back in Hungary.
My father, he didn't have much of an education. Growing up in a small town, small village in eastern Slovakia, I think he basically finished maybe the equivalent of elementary school and then went to work at his father's general store. Nevertheless, he was the sharpest, smartest person with the best common sense I've ever known in my life. Between his brains and his unbounded optimism, I used to think of him as being sort of a cat, that no matter how you drop him and where you drop him, he always managed to land on his feet. And so he managed to get a certificate from the Germans called Ein wichtiger Jude. Ein wichtiger Jude, I think it translates literally to an important Jew, but of course they didn't mean important. It means an essential Jew, somebody, a useful Jew, somebody that we can use. So he had this certificate that named him a wichtiger Jude, which basically guaranteed him safety as long as the certificate was in power. It didn't cover his family, his wife or his child. And the first year of my life, my parents tried to raise me and under the protection of this certificate. And then they realized that this is not going to work well. And so they decided to take advantage of the fact that my mother was from Hungary, a native Hungarian, and that she could pass for a non-Jew by her appearance. And they had false papers forged in her name. She presented herself as a single lady, non-Jewish. And the idea was that she would move to Hungary and live there as a non-Jewish single lady. The problem was how to get her and me to Hungary. My parents hired a woman to try to smuggle me across the border between Czechoslovakia and Hungary in the dark of night. And she tried, and she was stopped by the Czech border guards and fined a financial fine and turned around. And so they tried again a few nights later, and the same thing again happened, and she was caught again. So on the third time, my mother decided to take things into her own hands. She gave me a sleeping pill, put me in a sack, put the sack on her back, and she managed to cross the border into Hungary. In Hungary, as Bill said, we went to her hometown, Beregszasz, and then we went to the capital, Budapest. In Budapest, she found a pediatrician, a lady pediatrician, named Dr. Agnes Parzer. Dr. Parzer was an older lady, a spinster. She never married. She was a pediatrician, and she ran an orphanage out of her own home, out of her apartment. So my mother found her and deposited me with her to stay in the orphanage with the other kids. Of course, never admitting that I was a Jewish boy. Dr. Parzer was a little bit of a disciplinarian, not a little bit, quite a bit of a disciplinarian. She thought that the best food for kids was spinach. And if you didn't have your spinach for breakfast, if you didn't finish it, then you would get it back for lunch. And if you didn't finish it for lunch, you will have it again for supper until you finished it. She also forbade my mother from coming and visiting me because she said that a young kid cannot go through the emotional ups and downs, being happy when my mother comes and then being crying and being sad when she leaves. So my mother couldn't come and visit me. Fortunately, there was a small park near the apartment building where Dr. Parzer had their orphanage, and the park had a little bench on it. My mother would come and sit on the bench and hope to catch a glimpse of me, maybe on the terrace or through the window as I was playing with the other kids. Many years later, many years when I was already an adult, I went to Budapest on business and I took my mother with me. And we had a very good time sitting on the same bench, looking through the same window and the same terrace. My mother rented a room in a boarding house with her false papers. The law was in all of Europe at the time that the landlord who rents rooms needs to notify the local police of every new tenant. My mother knew that it would probably take the local police somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks to find out that the papers that her identity was forged. So she would rent a room, she would pay in advance for the first month, and then 2 weeks into the month, she would skip the place and go and find another place and do the whole thing all over again. And so she kept moving from place to place and being one step ahead of the law for about a year in Hungary.
That must have been quite costly for her to do that. How was she able to manage that?
As I said, my father, being, before he married, being a single man with not too many expenses, living in his parents' home, working in his parents' store, got reasonably well off. And so, fortunately, they had the means to buy forged papers, to pay rent in boarding houses and so on.
One more question before we move on. Were your parents able to be in touch during that time, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, they were not able to be in touch during this time, except whenever there was. My mother was not the only one who smuggled who crossed the border sneakily into Hungary, between Hungary and Czechoslovakia. At the time, the Jews were being hunted down by the Germans in both countries, and there was a constant traffic of people trying to cross the border illegally. And whenever either one of them knew of a Jew trying to cross the border, they would get in touch and try to send messages to each other.
And in fact, your father eventually did send a message to your mom to come back because he had decided it was time to go find another place to live, to get out of Bardejov. So he found a place in a very rural part of Slovakia. Tell us about that, how he found that place, and then how they got there and what happened once they got there.
His wichtige Jude certificate was expiring. He didn't think it was going to be renewed. The Germans were getting a little bit more desperate, and they were just basically picking up people off the street to send to the death camps. And my father decided that it's time to go into hiding. And he decided that the best place for Jews to hide would be to find a place, to find a village or a town that never had any Jewish population in it, reasoning that the Nazis would not go look for Jews in a place that was known not to ever have Jews in it. I don't know how he managed to do that research. This was the days before the internet and before Google. And as I said, he was a very resourceful person. It was not easy because the Jews had been living in Europe by that time for well over 1,000 years. And there was a Jewish population, even though a small Jewish population in some places, but there was a Jewish population almost anywhere in Europe. He found a small village in, as you said, in western Slovakia, named Sisov, that somehow managed never to have had any Jews living in it. And so he sent for my mother and for me. I do not know how he managed to get back. And the three of them went to Sisov, along with my father's best childhood friend, Shlomo Sheindorf was his name, and his wife and his son, who was a year older than me. They tagged along, and so the two couples and the two children.
Can I interrupt for a second? And you told me why the friend tagged along. What did he say to about your dad?
He said that my father was born lucky, and that my father, if anybody would survive this Holocaust, this catastrophe, then my father would be the person, and he wanted to be nearby. So he said wherever my father goes, he would go. And so they came, and 6 of them moved to Sisov. In Sisov, they headed directly to the local church, identified themselves to the priest as Jews looking for a hiding place, and asked for shelter. And of course, they were taking an enormous risk. The law was that anybody harboring Jews was shot on the spot. Anybody knowing of hiding Jews and not reporting it was shot on the spot. And not only they, but their family and their neighbors, under the assumption that the neighbors probably knew as well. And so that priest was taking an enormous risk, hearing these people telling him, "We are Jewish and we are trying to hide, please take care of us." And he agreed. And he agreed to shelter them in the church, but he said, I can take care of the adults. I cannot possibly take the risk of having 2 little children. I was 2 years old. The other boy, his name was Victor, but he went by Vicky. So Vicky was 3. I cannot take the risk of having little children here. So you will have to find another solution for the children. They were really quite at a quandary what to do about the children. When my father noticed that village, Sisov, like many other villages in Europe, it was also surrounded by a very thick forest and hills, forested hills. And he noticed on a hill right outside the village, on the top of the hill, there was a single building house. And he asked the priest, "What is that?" The priest told him that the people of this village of Sisov, they make their living by raising sheep and goats, mostly. And instead of each family taking care of their own sheep and goats, they have designated one person to be the village shepherd. And he would take the sheep out to graze and so on. And he would take care of everybody's sheep and goats. And In return, the village provided him with a place to live. Sheep and goats, I don't know what do you know about them, but one of the things about them is they don't smell the best. And so the house that they gave him was the house furthest out from the village on top of that hill. And my father decided that that was the ideal place for Vicky and for me. They went up the hill. They met the shepherd. His name was Jan. Jan is the Slovak version of John. Jan Mierny, his wife was Irena Mirnova. So they talked to them, and they asked if they would be willing to take care of the two children. At that time, this was 1944, it was beginning to be clear that the Germans were going to lose the war. The BBC, the British Broadcasting, kept broadcasting to the population of Europe, hold fast, we are coming, the war is not going to last very much longer. And so they considered that this is going to be a matter of maybe weeks at most, maybe a month, 2 months. So they wanted Jan and Irena to take care of us for the duration. And they agreed. They agreed to take us in. And they had two conditions that they wanted to put. One condition was they only had daughters, and they said it would look suspicious if people saw boys running around in the front yard. So we needed, they said, we needed to become girls, to be dressed as girls, to grow our hair, to behave like girls, and to be girls. To which the parents, my parents and Vicky's parents, agreed. The second condition was, since they only had daughters and they did not have a son, they wanted my parents to sign a paper saying that they should my parents not survive the war, that Jan and Irena had the right to adopt me as their own son. And my parents had not much of a choice, and agreed, and they signed. And to this very day, when things in my life, when things are rough, I'm known to say that, darn it, you know, today I could have been a very successful shepherd in Slovakia. After it's an interesting point here, after my parents left Vicky and me with the Miernis, and they went to the church, to hide in the church, it occurred to them that they had given the Miernis the perfect motivation to turn them in. The Miernis were desperate to have a boy. They were going to get me as their son if my parents didn't survive. What's to stop them from turning my parents in? And so they decided not to tell the Miernis where they were hiding, and they never did. At the end of the whole episode, after the war was over and we were all reunited, they very strongly apologized to the Miernis that we didn't trust you and we didn't tell you where we were hiding. But you know we couldn't, because we didn't want to put you in the position where you could turn us in. If you didn't know where we were, you couldn't turn us in. And Jan was a very special character. He was what I think you would call here a maverick. He was a chance taker, he was a gambler, he was a happy-go-lucky type of person. I think one of the reasons that he agreed to take the risk and take us in is because he wanted to stick it to the Nazis. And he was a very special character. And he said, oh, I knew all along where you were hiding. And they said, how did you know? And he said, well, my mother, against the advice of everybody, once a week or so at night, got out of hiding. I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but got out of hiding and made her way to the Mierny's house to visit a little boy. And he said, including during the winter. And he said one of the times when she came to visit after she left, I just followed her footsteps in the snow. And I knew exactly where you guys were hiding.
Arye, I'm mindful of our time, so I'm going to ask you now to turn to what the adults did when they left you at the Galkos. I'm sorry, at the Mierny's, but before we finish, I want you to come back to the Mierny's, but tell us, so your parents leave you with the shepherd and his family, and so they go back down to the church.
They go back down to the church. They were hiding. The priest put them in the bell tower of the church because nobody ever goes up there. And so the 4 adults were up in the bell tower under strict orders to be very quiet during the day. At night, the priest would come up on the ladder, bring them some food and water. They had a bucket up there to use as a bathroom, so the priest would take the bucket away to empty it. And they were there for something like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe. This was already the fall of 1944, and they were beginning to be worried. The winters in Europe are very harsh, and they were beginning to get of course, the bell tower is open to the elements, and they were beginning to get worried about the winter, but they were happy to have a place to hide, which seemed like a safe place. After about 2 or 3 weeks of being there, one night after the priest had left from his daily visit, they were asleep when they heard footsteps coming up the ladder. Of course, scared the daylight out of them. As a man they did not know, a strange man, showed up, coming up the ladder, and he said, aha, just like I thought, there are Jews hiding here. I think it's a miracle that nobody had a heart attack, but turns out that man, his name also was Jan Galko. The priest was the most respected man in every village in Czechoslovakia. And the village folks provided him with transportation. What is the transportation? The transportation was a horse and carriage. It's not really much of a carriage, it's a horse and a cart. And a person to drive the cart and to take care of the horse. Jan Galko was that person. He was the priest's coachman. So he came up and he said, there is a rumor in the village that there are Jews hiding in the church. And there is a rumor in the village that tomorrow a Nazi patrol is supposed to come and check this church out. And so if I were you, I would not stay here. Now, of course, they don't know who he is. They don't know if he's telling the truth. They don't know if this is maybe a trap. And even if all of this is true, what else can they do? And they say to him, what is it that we can do? And he says, you come with me to my home. Not having any other alternative at the time, middle of the night, he takes them to his home. Turns out that He and his 4 sons and his wife live in a hut, maybe the size of half of the stage. The whole hut is one room. There is a coal stove in a corner to keep the place warm and to cook on, and that is the kitchen. There are a couple of beds in the other corner, and that is the bedroom. It's a very small place, and it's clearly that they have a hard time making ends meet and feeding themselves, never mind bring in 4 more people. And so my parents and the other couple, they look around and they say, you know, we really appreciate the offer, and we really appreciate your generosity and what you're offering us, but we just don't see how this can work. And we'll manage somehow. We manage to this day. We shall continue to manage. Thank you very much. And they turn to leave. And his wife, Jan Galko's wife, who was standing there quietly the whole time, she starts to cry. My father thinks that maybe he had offended her in some way, and he says, I'm sorry, what it is that I said? What caused you to cry? And she says, all my life, I have been a good Catholic. I have gone to church every Sunday. I have done what Jesus would want me to do. And Jesus sent me 4 people. I can save 4 lives. And you want to leave? Not much they can do, and they stayed. The next day, Jan and his 4 sons, he had a big pile of hay in his backyard for the horse. They went and they dug a hole in the ground under the hay and covered it with a couple of pieces of lumber. And my parents and the other couple went into that hole. And the procedure was that during the day, all 4 of them lie under the hay in that hole. They called it their bunker. They lay in the bunker. There was not enough room there for a person to move. If one person wanted to turn, everybody had to turn. And that's where they stayed during the day. After dark, they could come out to take a breather, to go to the bathroom, to stretch. Once a week or so, one of the sons would go into the forest and shoot a squirrel or a rabbit and bring it home, and that would be the meat meal for the week. And they stayed in that bunker for 8 months, until April of 1945. And as I said before, they, once a week or once every other week, my mother would crawl out of the bunker at night against the advice of everybody else to go and, if there were 3 things that my mother was afraid of, it was the darkness, the woods, and dogs. And nevertheless, she would get out in the darkness and go into the woods with all the dogs of the village barking to go and visit her son and then come back.
Arye, if you don't mind, tell us what you can a little bit about your life with Vicky, now living with a shepherd and his family, while your parents spent 8 months in their hole in the ground.
Relatively speaking, I had a good life. The Miernis embraced Mickey and me as part of the family. We had our chores with the sheep and with the goats and with the household. The one thing was, it was difficult for me My mother tongue was Hungarian, because my mother was Hungarian. I also spoke German, because the common language between my father, who was Czechoslovakian, and my mother, who was Hungarian, their common language was German. And of course, I spoke Slovakian. I had to speak only Slovakian, never utter a word in any other language. I had to call Jan Papa and Irena Mama in Slovakian, instead of what I was used to calling my mother Anyuka, which is the Hungarian word for mother. And Jan also instituted an exercise just in case somebody shows up unexpectedly. That whenever he made a sound and said teraz, which means now, Vicky and I were supposed to jump into the coal bin. Right next to the coal stove in the corner of the room, there was a big bin full of coal with a cover. We were supposed to jump into the coal bin, close the cover over us, and stay there until he told us to come out. Of course, he did the right thing to prepare for the case of anybody showing up. I don't know if anybody ever did show up, but we had those exercises very often. And being 2 years old at the time, my memories of the period are not very solid, but I do remember very, very vividly how I hated and how afraid I was of the dark in that coal bin, with the cover closed above me. The other thing I remember very vividly from this time, Jan was a very simple person. He was a sheep shepherd. He was a hard worker. But every night after work, he would go down to the village, to the pub, with his friends, and he would come home having a couple of beers, maybe too many, and take us all out of bed, his daughters, Vicky, me, and his wife, line us up, take off his belt, and give us a taste of his belt, beat us all up, just in case we had done something wrong. So my two vivid memories of that period.
And you said that when he hadn't had too much to drink, he was really a really pleasant guy.
He was a very pleasant guy, and he was a very fun guy, because he had this impish character about him.
And you were with him for more than 8 months as well.
By the time I finished being there, I have grown to regard Irena and Jan as my parents, actually. And I knew my mother because she came to visit frequently, but I regarded Irena and Jan as basically as my parents.
Arye, two other things as we start to close out I'd like you to share with us. One, of course, was Liberation Day and reuniting with your parents.
Just like the day I was born was a very sad day, the first transport out of Bardejov, my third birthday, April 7 of 1945, was the day that the Red Army liberated Czechoslovakia. And shortly thereafter, Vicky and I were reunited with our parents. By that time, I don't know about Vicky. I did not recognize my father at the time. It took a while. It took a while for us to become a family again. We went back to Bardejov to find out that everyone who stayed in Bardejov, 3 of my father's brothers had left Bardejov beginning of the war. One went to New York to find his fortune in America, and 2 of them went as pioneers to what was then Palestine, to start building the country there. Other than those, everybody who was left in Bardejov and their families were gone. Bardejov had a very thriving Jewish community, and it was all gone. My parents did not want to stay there. They moved to a nearby city named Košice, which is a big city, relatively speaking, in Czechoslovakia. And my younger brother was born there after the war. And then a couple of years later, we all emigrated to the state of Israel.
Arye, there's obvious, and I think it's obvious to everybody here, that you were only able to just touch the surface of what you could have shared with us, and I wish we had all afternoon. But and of course, getting to Israel, starting a new life in Israel, you ended up joining the Israeli army, became a tank commander, 7 years in the army, you fought in the Six-Day War. So much more you could share with us, but the one last question I have for you, Arye, is, and when Arye's finished this question, please stay with us because he will conclude our program in a moment. You said to me when I first met you, I have always been floored by the Slovakian families who saved us. And you were able to have the Mirnis and the Galko families formally recognized by the State of Israel. Tell us about that really significant event in your life.
I want everybody to understand, and of course you do understand, it's not just a matter of the inconvenience of having extra people living with you for a long time when you can hardly afford to put food on the table for your own family. It's not just that, it's the fact that it took unbelievably, incredible amount of courage for people in those days to harbor Jews. They were putting their lives, their family lives, their neighbors' lives in huge jeopardy. Those were not overly educated, sophisticated people. They were people who knew right from wrong, who knew good from evil, who did the right thing at the right time. And I'm in awe of both of those families and of the priests at the church who did all of that basically just because their conscience told them to do that. Years later, the organization Yad Vashem, which is an international organization that exists to commemorate the Holocaust, they declare selected people who have shown outstanding humanity during the Holocaust as the righteous among the nations. And by the time that I was a young adult and my younger brother was a young adult, we have nominated, and I say we, but it was really, I have to give the credit to my younger brother who did most of the legwork of collecting the documentation and the notarized testimonies and photographs and all this kind of stuff, to nominate both of those families as the righteous among the nations. They were indeed designated as such, and when that happened, my family, my brother's family, some of our cousins and so on, we all made a pilgrimage to Czechoslovakia to be present at the ceremony where the Israeli ambassador presented them with the prize, with the certificates and the medals. And my mother, who was an older lady by then, made a speech, cried, and it was a very, very touching ceremony and a very touching, and they deserved every bit of it.
Thank you, Arye. One other comment. Probably it's on the minds of everybody. Your parents and their friends that were in that hole together. You shared with me that after that experience, they remained friends for the rest of their lives after that. We didn't have a chance for you to ask Arye some questions. We could have used another few hours. But I would like to let you know that when we finish, when Arye closes our program, he will remain on the stage, and we invite you to come up here afterwards and meet Arye, get your picture taken with him if you want, ask him a question. So we'll have that opportunity afterwards, and please take advantage of that. I want to thank all of you for being with us. We'll have first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. When Arye finishes in just a moment, and I'm going to ask you to stay for that, our photographer, Joel, right here, one of the three that we have today, is going to come up on stage, and he's going to take a picture of Arye with you as the backdrop. And that's a really wonderful memento of today's program. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. So with that, I'm going to turn back to Arye to close today's program.
Thank you, Bill. Even though my story is told against the dark and tragic background of the Holocaust, I consider my story to be one of inspiration and redemption. My parents, when they came to Sisov and put their fate in the hands of the priest whom they did not know, and then the Miernis and the Galkovs, it is possible that they happened to meet the three only righteous people in Sisov, and it was just their luck that they have met those three righteous people. I think it's much more likely that there were many other people in Sisov who, when the chips were down, when they were faced, if they would have been faced with the same kind of a hard decision, with that kind of a life and death type of a situation, I like to believe that there are many other people in Sisov who would have done the right thing, just like those people did. And if that is true, then it only follows that many of us today, whether we believe it or not, if we are faced with a moral dilemma of this magnitude, of this kind of a situation, that many of us would find it in themselves to come up with the courage and the generosity and the decency to do what is right at the time. And that is my hope. Thank you very much.